Hello, good evening and welcome back. So as you can see, we are very nearly finished on our sweater dress. What we're going to do this evening are the cuffs and the hem. So we're going to use the same ribbing that we used at the neck, and we're going to do pretty much the same process on each of the cuffs and then finally on the hem. Now, just a little side note, because I tried this on and it actually looks pretty nice, almost sort of as it is with a plain hem. So if you wanted to make this slightly longer, and someone was asking me this question actually, if you wanted to make this a slightly longer dress, you absolutely could do. And then if you wanted to, if I move that there you go, you could just leave the hem without a band on the bottom. So you could just overlock or the hem, or well, in fact what you'd probably do is fold it up by 1.5 centimetres all the way round, and then just zigzag stitch. I'd use the same zigzag as I used on the neck so it matches, and you could just do a plain hem. It's just a matter of styling and preference really. There's a lot of choices with this style actually. There's lots of modifications and things that you can do to kind of make it your own. But anyway, that's just a little side note. I'm going to continue with the pattern as it's described in the book. So the next thing that we're going to do are the cuffs. Now I'm doing the balloon sleeves, so as you can see my cuffs are really big and they've got those gather stitches in them from before. So I'm going to set that aside for just 1 second, and I'm going to get my cuff pieces. So I've got 2, and I've got the marked C from before. And what I want to do with these is, the first thing to do is simply to fold them in half. So you want to fold your cuffs with right sides together. So we know that the little C stickers were on the wrong side. So folding them right sides together, and I'm just going to overlock down here and down here with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. If you're on the sewing machine again, you're just going to do your lightning or your stretch stitch at 1.5 centimetres and at 1.5 centimetres so that you're creating 2 tubes. If you're looking at your cuff bands and you're trying to figure out which way to fold them, you're folding them so that the rib is going along the length. Okay, you don't want the rib going horizontally. There's your raw edges there that you're going to sew down. The rib is going in the same direction as your line of your sewing. I'll just do 2 at a time because I'm repeating the same process over and over again. So just pop a couple of wonder clips on, and the reason why I am using wonder clips is because I prefer wonder clips to pins when I'm overlocking. I don't like getting pins near my overlocker. I was told that by the person who I bought my overlocker from, because they can, if one falls into the mechanism, they can cause some damage. So I've just put a couple of clips on each. Let's hop over to our overlocker. Righto, so I'm sewing or overlocking with a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance. So that raw edge there is matched up with the 1.5 here, and those raw edges are nicely matched together. There you go. So I've now got a tube. I'm going to repeat the same process with my other cuff. It's both my cuffs done. So you can see you've got 2 tubes. I'm going to trim off the extra bit of overlocking there, and then I'm going to take those to my iron, and I am going to press the overlocking flat to one side, and then the next thing, let's take off these stickers. The next thing I want to do is fold them in half. Do you remember how we did this with the neckband to create the cuff, because it's going to be doubled? So we want the raw edges matching, so you're folding it in half in on itself, so that seam that you've just sewn is tucked in the inside. Obviously you're going to press it first so that it's all nice and flat, and if you've used a sewing machine, just press it open and flat, and if you're using an overlocker, press it to one side. And then I will match up those raw edges there, so you've got a fold on that side and your raw edges on that side, and that is what will eventually be your cuff. Now the cuff on the balloon sleeve is a bit deeper than the cuff on the conventional sleeve, the straight sleeve, so don't worry if yours does look a bit different in proportion to mine. They are slightly different depths. So I'm going to go and press those now, and then we'll come back for the next step. So there are my two cuffs, raw edges matching and seams pressed to the side, folded in half. And we're now going to attach those to the sleeves. So if you remember, I'm doing the gathered sleeve, so I've got my gathering stitches here from before, and I'm just going to pull those through. And what I like to do is ruche it up as far as they'll go, tuck the cuff on, and then splay it out to fit. So I'm just going to grab two of those threads there, and just like I was doing on the shoulder head, on the sleeve head, it's the same sort of process. So I could just hold those two threads there and give them a pull and travel that fabric along to create those gathers. I'll do half this side and then half the other side. And then once it's all as scrunched up as can be, we'll put the cuffs on and spread out the gathers to fit the cuffs. Now, if you're doing the plain sleeve version, you won't have to do this bit, so you can just relax for now. Almost halfway, and I'll grab the other two little thready bits on the other side, yeah, and pull those along. Okay, so that's as scrunched up as can be there. And now what I'll do is okay, and now what I'll do is I'll take my cuff, and I've got my raw edges there, put my hand in it there, and I'll grab my sleeve and pull it through so that I've got all the raw edges on the same side. And the first thing I want to do is to find the seams and match them up. There's the seam for my cuff, and there's the seam for my underarm. So I'll start off just by matching them up, move those threads out the way, and I'll just put a clip there just to hold those so that all it's nice. It just looks nice if all of those seams are sort of aligned, and that's on the underarm. Okay, so now it's a bit fiddly this, because you're dealing with a fairly small opening, and there's quite a bulk of fabric in there actually, because these are quite puffy balloon sleeves. They're quite, when you look at the sleeve pattern on this one, it looks quite gigantic. And the sleeve, and by comparison the cuff is quite narrow, but you just want to make sure that it's all sort of sitting flat. There we are. And then we're just going to put some wonder clips around the edge here, so you can see how those raw edges are all in the same place. So we're going to put some underclips around here, and just as I go I'll just sort of splay the gathers to kind of just by eye. I'll just see that they're even, and then what we're going to do is we're going to baste this, check the appearance, and then if we're happy then we overlock or we zigzag stitch. And that's just because it's very easy to undo those basting stitches. And if you're just looking at it and you're thinking, gosh, those gathers aren't very even, it's very easy to unpick basting stitches. But if anyone out there has ever unpicked overlocking, oh my goodness, and that is not something you want to do, not even on a good day. Avoid unpicking overlocking at all costs, which is why it's always good to sort of baste everything first. Make sure that nothing's getting caught up, and also make sure that the raw edges are all pointing towards the outside. It looks kind of like the inside of a shell. Looking at this here, it's quite funny, like a strange sea creature. There we go. So that looks about right. I've got a few more gathers there than anywhere else. Let's just try and even that out. Okay, so once you're happy that it looks roughly even, and we can go over and just baste that around. Okie dokie, so basting, straight stitch and nice long stitch length of between 4 and 5. And now, normally if we're going round in a circle we'd take off our free arm and put the sleeve on there, but this sleeve opening is no way going to fit round a free arm. So what we do instead is we just sort of put this like in here like this. Hopefully that's clear enough. And then I tell you what, the wonder clips are clanking a bit and getting in the way. But and then what we'll do is we'll sew round in a circle, but the circle's above the presser foot, not beneath it, because it's just too small to fit around the free arm. So what I'll do is move you a little bit, hopefully you can see. Okay, so I'm going to make sure as I go, I'm just going to go really slowly. I'm going to make sure that all of the raw edges are pointing here, and I'm just sewing with 1 centimetre seam allowance. It's a 1.5 centimetre seam allowance on the cuff, but just for the basting, doesn't matter too much, just come in a bit from the edge there. And can you see that I'm just walking that cuff round in a circle as I go? Now obviously I'm doing the gathered sleeve. If you're doing the straight sleeve, what you'll find is that the sleeve opening is slightly bigger than the cuff. And just like we did with the neckline, you will have two. If you can't remember, go back and watch the neckline video again. And that is the same technique for attaching your cuff, which is that the cuff is deliberately made smaller so that it pulls everything in. So as you go, if you're doing the straight sleeve and you're now attaching your cuff, as you go, you will just have to stretch the rib to fit the sleeve, because that way you get that nice sort of characteristic. You don't want your cuff to be exactly the same diameter as your sleeve. You sort of want that characteristic sweatshirt design where it pulls it in a bit, and that's because these 2x2 ribs or 1x1 ribs have more stretch in them than a conventional knit, so they kind of spring back smaller, and that looks really nice. It's quite tricky to get the gathers where the where your gathering stitch ended, in order to allow for that underarm seam to be made. So you might just have to sort of rucle it up a little bit by hand. I like that word I just made up, rucle. You know what I mean. Scrunch. It's a cross between scrunch, ruche and scrumple. What am I talking about? Here we go. I think I'm pretty much back at the beginning. Okay, so move the camera back a bit. There we are. So you can see that I've gone round there roughly about a centimetre in, and all those gathers are now sewn onto the ribbing and the raw edges are all matching. So I can now see if I flip that round, I can just ask myself, take a good look at it and think, okay, yeah, that looks pretty even. There's my underarm seam. Oh, it's a couple of millimetres out. I'll let myself off. Yeah, I think that looks pretty even gathering there on that cuff. So what I'll do is I'll repeat that same process on the other cuff, and then once I've done it on both of them, then I'll hop over to the overlocker to overlock those seams. Okay, so both of my cuffs have been basted together. So I'm now going to do the overlocking, and again I just have to, what I'll do is I'll lift my foot and I will just put that entire cuff underneath there. A bit fiddly. I just had to swing the camera out of the way there so that I could get my hand round. So you can see that I just lifted my overlocker foot and popped my cuff underneath, and the entire cuff is now sitting above the presser foot, and I'm just going to come round in a circle and sew the cuff. Now there are some instructions for sewing cuffs on overlockers where you actually cut a notch in to get you started at the right depth. I'm not going to do that. I'm just going to sort of start at the edge and come in a bit, just because if I cut a notch, then those basting stitches and gathers are going to start to get undone. Right, I'm just conscious of the fact that my hands are sort of getting in the way there, so I'm going to try and do this without getting my hand in the way so that you can see what's happening. There we are, that's better. I've moved the overlocker further away. So off I go. Pressing the wrong pedal again. So when I'm doing this, I'm just making sure that this rib underneath is nice and flat, and I should just angle it in a bit to get to that sort of 1.5. I'm there now at that 1.5 mark, and I just want to make sure that all of my sleeve fabric is sitting flat down inside, and I want to make sure that my rib is nice and flat underneath. It is fiddly on the smaller bits, but just go slow, take your time, don't rush, never sew in a rush. It's going to go wrong. Hopefully you can see what I'm doing there, making sure that all the raw edge bits are there. If you're doing this on the machine, you're just going to go around the cuff with a 1.5 cm seam allowance using your lightning bolt stitch. These overlocker feet are spring loaded, so I'm just lifting that up there to make sure that everything is tucked nicely underneath. I'm coming all the way back round to where I started again. Make sure that you're twisting the sleeve round as well as you go, because you don't want the gathers to be kind of twisting or pointing in the wrong direction. You want the gathers to point directly up. So just take your time, sew a little bit or overlock a little bit, then reposition, then continue. And back where I started, and I shall just finish off down here. So there's a little bit of a peak where I crossed over, but once that's turned through, that won't show. That's just on the seam allowance on the inside. So there's my cuff overlocked together. I've got a few little straggly threads that I just need to trim off from, and sort of if I've got any gather stitches showing on the outside that I can see, I'll just whip them out. They're fairly easy to whip out because they're those lovely big stitches and we didn't do a back stitch or anything, so I'll just go through and neaten that off, and then I'll repeat the same process on the other cuff. And there are my two cuffs. So just as you're going through doing your cuffs, just try to make sure that they end up the same depth, the same depth of cuff here, and you know, it'll make them look nice and even. Obviously you don't want one cuff kind of deeper than the other, and also keep a consistent depth all the way round, and that's really just by sewing nice and slowly and obeying those seam allowances. Otherwise you have to just walk around with one hand in your pocket all the time and no one will ever know. But you really kind of want those to match up and be the same depth. So if it helps you to do so, you could even draw on your cuff before you sew. You could draw the seam allowance on and then use that as a line to kind of as a sewing guide. It's just something I thought of there that might help, just because you do want those to both be exactly the same. Okay,